He was kicked out of the clinic because of his red MAGA hat, but Dr. Carter had no idea who he was dealing with. One silent gesture from the patient sparked a scandal that changed everything. How did an ordinary visit turn into a lesson that shook the internet? It was early morning at an upscale private clinic, where everything exuded an air of prestige. Marble floors gleamed under the soft light of stylish fixtures, and the air carried the subtle scent of expensive flowers arranged in elegant vases. Every corner of this place was like a living advertisement for luxury and success. But even here, the atmosphere could be unsettled by something as simple as a hat. In the waiting room sat a man who appeared calm, but could stir a storm of indignation with his mere presence. Around 50 years old, his confident posture and piercing gaze revealed a man accustomed to being at the center of attention. Richard Miller wore a simple yet neat dark blazer, jeans, and a bright red hat bearing the words, "Make America Great Again." This accessory was like a magnet, drawing the stares of the staff, some curious, others visibly annoyed. Dr. James Carter, the clinic's general practitioner, entered the waiting room with an expression of absolute calm, which immediately gave way to a flicker of irritation. He was in his early 40s, with neatly groomed hair and an authoritative gaze that hinted at a man who liked being in control. "Mr. Miller?" he asked, trying to mask his annoyance. "Yes, that's me," Richard replied, looking up as though anticipating that this interaction wouldn't be simple. With a gesture, Dr. Carter invited him to follow. Their footsteps echoed against the impeccably clean marble tiles. The doctor's office, furnished with the same refined taste, now seemed tense. James shut the door firmly, as if it might protect them from prying ears, and let out a heavy sigh. "You're probably aware," he began, crossing his arms, "that your hat elicits a mixed reaction." His voice was calm, but a note of irritation was unmistakable. "Of course," Richard replied, removing the hat and carefully placing it on his lap. "But I believe that's my choice. Or does your clinic have a dress code?" James paused, as though considering whether to continue. "It's less about policy and more about the impact of your actions on others," he said, tactfully. Richard leaned forward slightly, the corners of his mouth lifting in a faint smile. "Dr. Carter, I'm just here for an appointment. If my hat bothers someone, I'd say that's their issue, not mine. I didn't come here for a political debate." His response was so calm and assured that James faltered for a moment. Before he could reply, there was a knock at the door, and a nurse poked her head in. "Excuse me, Dr. Carter, but Mr. Wilson needs to see you. It's urgent." James nodded, gesturing for Richard to wait, and stepped out. The moment the door closed, Richard pulled out his phone and began scrolling thoughtfully. His expression remained calm, though a hint of amusement played on his lips. When Carter returned a few minutes later, he looked slightly less composed. Sitting down across from Richard, his tone was softer this time. "Mr. Miller, I think we can find common ground. Let's just discuss what brought you here." Richard set his phone aside and looked up. "Of course, Doctor," he said with a faint smile. "But first let me ask you this. Isn't it fascinating how a small detail like this hat can affect people so profoundly?" Richard slowly placed the hat back on his head, his gaze piercing through Dr. Carter. James looked down, sensing that something critical and beyond his control was beginning to unravel. The doctor's office felt like an oasis of order. Pristine white walls, modern furniture, meticulously arranged files on shelves, and framed photographs of Dr. James Carter at various events, presumably showcasing his active involvement in charitable activities. Yet, despite the visual serenity, the tension in the air was almost palpable. Seated at his spotless desk, Dr. Carter tried to maintain a professional demeanor, but his clenched jaw and irritated glare betrayed his displeasure. He exhaled sharply, as though summoning patience. "Mr. Miller, your hat. Of course, it's your personal choice, but how should I put this? Creates a certain tension among our staff and patients," he said, with a faintly sarcastic tone. Richard raised an eyebrow, feigning mild surprise. He appeared relaxed, but his calm, focused gaze made the doctor uneasy. "Interesting, Doctor. Am I breaking any laws? Or perhaps violating your clinic's rules?" Richard replied, tilting his head slightly as if issuing a challenge. Carter frowned, his fingers drumming nervously on the desk. "It's not about laws, it's about respect for others," he retorted sharply. "You might want to consider the impression you're making on those around you." "So, you believe that telling people what to wear is a form of respect?" Richard's voice remained steady, but it carried a new firmness. Dr. Carter adjusted his tie nervously, trying to maintain his composure. "Mr. Miller, I'm not sure I can proceed with your consultation under these circumstances," he said, his voice rising slightly. At that moment, a commotion could be heard outside the office. A few clinic staff members, drawn by the elevated tones, had gathered in the hallway, trying to eavesdrop discreetly. Among them was Nurse Linda, who had even pulled out her phone to record the scene. "You're saying you're refusing to treat me?" Richard asked, his piercing gaze locking onto the doctor's. His tone was firm, devoid of aggression. Caught off guard, Carter hesitated before nodding, trying to appear resolute. "That's correct," he said, folding his arms. "We have to maintain the atmosphere of our clinic." Richard leaned back in his chair, then slowly stood. Pulling out his phone, he activated the camera and pointed it at Dr. Carter. "All right, then. I suppose your reputation will explain why the clinic refuses to treat patients because of a hat," he said, with deliberate sarcasm. Carter turned pale. It took him a few seconds to grasp that their conversation could now become public. Outside, Linda stifled a laugh, biting her lip as she continued filming. "Are you threatening me?" Carter demanded, struggling to maintain authority. "Threats? Oh no, Dr. Carter," Richard replied smoothly, smiling. "I'm simply documenting your stance for my own peace of mind." The noise in the hallway grew louder as staff and even a few patients gathered, their curious faces peeking through the gap in the door. "Linda," Carter barked, glaring at the nurse. "Get back to work. There's nothing to see here." But it was too late. Richard, holding up his phone, walked toward the door, pausing briefly before stepping out. "Doctor, I hope you'll be more careful with your words next time. Not all patients are as patient as I am." The door closed behind Richard, leaving Carter in a state of utter bewilderment. The hallway, once filled with whispers and suppressed laughter, erupted into open chatter. The doctor sat at his desk, staring at his framed photographs, which suddenly seemed hollow and meaningless. Richard rose from his chair with the deliberate confidence of someone used to making high-stakes decisions. He removed the infamous red hat, folded it carefully, and looked Dr. Carter directly in the eye. There was no threat or aggression in his tone, only a calmness that was far more unsettling than any outburst. "Dr. Carter," he began evenly, "I didn't intend for this to turn into a spectacle. Honestly, I'd have preferred a quieter morning. But since we've come to this point, allow me to properly introduce myself. I'm Richard Miller, the Minister of Health for this country." The room seemed to freeze. Time stood still, and the air felt as though it had been sucked out. Dr. Carter's face, stern and icy just moments ago, turned a deep shade of beet red. His eyes widened, and his jaw slackened. Outside the office, the hallway fell into an eerie silence, as though the staff had collectively decided to hold their breath. "What?" stammered Carter, his voice barely a whisper, more of a garbled croak. "You heard me correctly. Richard confirmed with a faint smile. "I oversee the nation's healthcare reform efforts. And, I've decided to personally visit facilities across the country, unannounced and incognito, to see firsthand how patients are treated, to see things through the eyes of an ordinary citizen." The staff in the corridor stirred. Someone let out a soft gasp. Another nearly dropped a tray of instruments. Nurse Linda, still recording on her phone, stumbled backward into a colleague, spilling a glass of water onto his scrubs. Yet even this commotion failed to break the magnetic focus on the scene unfolding in the office. Dr. Carter swallowed hard, his voice trembling as if it might crack under the weight of the situation. I'm so sorry, Minister Miller. I didn't know," he stammered, his words weak and pitiful. Richard raised a hand, cutting him off with a quiet but commanding gesture. "Your ignorance doesn't concern me, Doctor. What matters is how you treated me as a patient. Is this how you believe people seeking help should be approached?" Carter opened his mouth, but no words came. His eyes darted around the room, searching for some kind of lifeline, but everyone seemed to have melted into the background, pretending to be invisible. "I'm sure you're a skilled physician," Richard continued, tucking the hat into his jacket pocket. "But your attitude toward people? That's where you might need some therapy yourself." Someone in the hallway let out a nervous giggle. Dr. Carter shot a withering glare toward the door, but Richard had already turned to leave. Opening the door, he passed the staff, giving Linda a brief nod of acknowledgement. She blushed, secretly proud that she had captured the entire exchange on video. Richard walked out of the clinic with the same confidence he had carried in, leaving behind a room full of whispers, bewildered stares, and a frozen Dr. Carter. Minutes later, someone in the hallway murmured in awe, "He's like something out of a movie." Meanwhile, Linda's phone began buzzing with messages. The video she'd sent to a friend was already gaining traction. Dr. Carter stood rooted in place, the weight of the situation settling in like a heavy fog. His once confident posture was now visibly deflated, and every attempt to form a coherent thought seemed to evaporate before it reached his lips. I'm so sorry, sir," he finally managed, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. "This was unacceptable. Please, allow me to make amends somehow." But Richard Miller, the Minister of Health, merely smiled, a calm, knowing smile that had the power to strip away any remaining semblance of authority from the man before him. "Dr. Carter," Richard began with a measured tone, laced with just enough sarcasm to cut through the tension. "I don't need your apology. I hope you take this as a learning experience. As we've seen today, sometimes people need their mistakes pointed out before they can recognize them." He turned toward the door, his composure a sharp contrast to the chaos brewing behind him. "This matter is finished," he added as he stepped into the hallway. "I have more important things to attend to." The soft thud of the office door closing reverberated through the corridor, and then something unexpected happened. Linda, the nurse who had been secretly filming, began clapping. The applause started hesitantly, awkwardly, as it often does in such moments, but it quickly gained momentum. Soon, the hallway was filled with clapping. Some joined in out of admiration, others simply because they didn't know what else to do. Dr. Carter stood in the middle of it all, his face burning with embarrassment. He scanned the corridor, desperate for a sympathetic look, but there were none. Even the security guard appeared ready to crawl behind the nearest cabinet. Meanwhile, Richard Miller strode through the clinic's corridor, holding his hat in one hand as his footsteps echoed against the marble floor. Staff members watched him go with expressions of awe, as if they were witnessing the protagonist of a blockbuster film. One nurse whispered to her colleague, "I'll never forget this. It was like a movie." "Yeah, he absolutely owned them," someone added from behind. The next day, the video of the incident recorded by Linda went viral, spreading across the internet like wildfire. Headlines screamed, "Health Minister teaches clinic staff a lesson in professionalism," "How one hat changed a career," and of course, Dr. Carter under fire for bias in the workplace. Comment sections were divided. Some lambasted Carter for his intolerance, while others praised Richard for his composure and dignity. But one thing was clear. The clinic announced an immediate ethics retraining for its entire staff. Dr. Carter, after issuing several public apologies and citing work-related stress, was placed on temporary leave. His photograph, edited into a meme with the caption, "When you lose to a patient and the internet in one day," spread across social media like wildfire. Meanwhile, Richard sat in his office at the Ministry of Health, scrolling through the news on his phone. He turned the red hat over in his hands and smirked. On the screen was a freeze frame from Linda's video, capturing him walking out of the clinic to a round of applause. "Well," he murmured to himself, "make health great again." Just then, a notification popped up on his phone. 10 million views.